All right. So welcome to session 5. That was a very interesting discussion. And it's a lot of sort of issues that are interesting to a lot of us who think about probability panels and why people stay and why they join. So that was great. There may be some more time to talk about that at the end if we would really like to do that. I'm Jill Darling. I'm Survey Director for the Understanding America Study. Moderating session 5. This is hurdles and recent progress in administering cognitive tests to internet-based survey panels. The last session of the day. It also wins the award for longest panel title, I think. It should be an interesting one. The first and last panelists are members of the CIPHER Understanding America Studies team that's focused on piloting and implementing cognitive tests in the internet panel. They're presenting about issues that were encountered and studied in 2 different aspects of that implementation, including the results of negotiating how to do those tests with our IRB and what we learned about the impact of environmental distraction. I'm so pleased we also have a report from work that has been done in this area in the older Australian twin study. There's just a lot to learn about what is needed to successfully implement and interpret cognitive tests online and how they can be done. So we'll take questions after each session. We have a small panel. There's likely to be time at the end if more questions occur to you during the sessions. Please type your questions into the chat as always, or raise your hand. And let's get started. The first session is titled Consequences of Web-Based Consent Protocols When Assessing Cognition in Older Adults. This is presented by Margaret Gatz. She's a senior scientist at CIPHER and professor of psychology and gerontology. She studies the mental health of older adults, including risk and protective factors for Alzheimer's disease, age-related change in depressive symptoms, and evaluation of the effects of interventions. In addition to helping guide our work in the UAS, she works with many twin studies, co-organized the international consortium IJAPS, and is studying dementia in an indigenous Bolivian population. Take it away, Margie.
Overlay. I'm going to tell you a little story. The Understanding America study, as noted, is an ongoing probability-based internet panel with many members of the panel having participated for 5 years or more already. The members of the panel get 1 or 2 emails every month. They are invited to participate in new surveys at that time. So in 2020, we were funded for a project that entailed giving the UAS participants the same survey by internet and by telephone in order to compare responses in each format. The questions in the study comprised a brief cognitive evaluation, things like how well participants could remember a list of words. As a first step, then, we focused on UAS panel members who were age 50 and older, and we invited the panelists to complete a consent survey. In the consent survey, we described the study, including what they would have to do, that is, completing the same study by phone and by web, and asked them whether they agreed to participate, and if they said yes, we randomized them to one or the other first. But not so fast. The IRB reviewed the consent survey and expressed concern that we needed to determine whether potential participants were competent to consent to the survey. Here, I would remind you that the same UAS panel members had been participating in the UAS for years. They'd responded to COVID tracking surveys. They'd responded to daybreak polls for the 2020 election. They've responded to the health and retirement study biannual questions that included cognitive tests as well as economic questions. After negotiation with the IRB, we settled on including 3 multiple choice questions in the consent survey to determine whether the potential participant had understood the study and what they would be asked to do in the study. Each question had 2 response options, and all 3 questions had to be answered correctly in order for the participant to be allowed to participate If they missed any of the questions, they were thanked and they were told they were not eligible for this particular survey, but they would be contacted for future surveys. So following up on the questions that were asked, what happened? Well, here we show the percent who incorrectly answered each of the 3 multiple choice questions. In total, 19% of the potential participants aged 50 or older failed the consent screen. Most missed 1 question, some missed 2 questions. The easiest question was, do you have to take part in this study, or is it okay to say no? The hardest question was, if you said no to the study, would you be kicked off of the UAS panel? So 19% is simply, on the face of it, too large a proportion of participants aged 50 and older to be cognitively impaired to the extent of lacking capacity to consent. So we looked at existing UAS data to characterize the people who failed the consent survey. So first, demographic differences. So what I'm showing here is the percent who failed the screen and odds ratios testing for statistical significance for each demographic variable. Counterintuitively, it was the 50-year-olds who were more likely to fail the screen than people in their 60s and 70s. There were not significant differences between men and women. There were significant differences where ethnic and racial groups other than non-Hispanic whites were about twice as likely to fail the screen as non-Hispanic whites. And this was true for each individual group: Black, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American. Those with lower household income and those with lower formal education were also more likely to fail the screen. We then looked at prior cognitive tests that the potential participants had completed at the most recent occasion prior to being sent the consent survey. And those who failed the consent screen did have significantly lower scores across the entire cognitive battery, here shown with a t-test comparing the scores for those who did not fail to those who failed the screen. There was one exception that had a different pattern, stop and go switching task. In this task, what the task measures is a response time, how quickly people can click on stop or on go in response to a red or a green cue. And there were not differences in speed of responding to those cues. Where there was a difference was those who failed the screen were significantly more likely to have under 70% of those clicks be correct. In other words, the people who were failing the screen were also clicking stop when they should click go. We then looked at the most recent health and retirement survey biannual questions where panelists had been asked whether they had ever been told they had Alzheimer's disease or that they had dementia. And we took this as a gold standard for calculating sensitivity and specificity. Of those who stated they'd ever been told they had a dementia or Alzheimer's disease, which is this bottom row, only 6 out of the 23 actually failed the consent screen. The other 17 passed. We can also look at the right-hand column, which is the 365 people who failed the consent screen, and fully 98% of the people who failed the consent screen had never been told that they had dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So what to make of this? The consent screening questions did not appear very successful in assessing competence or lack of competence due to cognitive impairment. We screened out far too many people with the questions. One interpretation is the questions may actually function more as an instructional manipulation check. In other words, whether the potential participant was paying attention to what was being asked in the study or whether they were just clicking on stuff. And concerningly, the consent questions screened out persons of color and those with lower SES, which is obviously contrary to ensuring equal opportunity to participate. We also end up having some recommendations. One is that at least the third question was way too complex. We also think that we should give a second chance if people fail a question. At that point, we might have their attention and give them a chance to answer again, or even take the approach of describing the study and asking people to click yes or no, whether they had understood the information that was being presented, so that they're indicating they understand each element rather than being given a multiple choice test on what was involved in the study. And at this point, we're working through options with the IRB. So thank you.
Thanks, Margie. We'll open it up for questions if anybody has any. I mean, this was a frustrating process for us. I'm on this team, and we had to negotiate with IRB, as Margie said, about what to ask. They were even concerned at some points in time about whether people might become demented between the first survey and the second. So this was an ongoing discussion with them, and I consulted several colleagues through APOR and other organizations to find out if anybody had dealt with anything like this. And so one thing I would be interested in, if you don't have any questions, if you have had any similar discussions with your IRB, particularly if you had some ideas about how to negotiate with them about doing cognitive surveys. It seems to bring up concerns about people being able to consent.
Did we look at response time on the questions? Yes, although I don't know the answer. One of our colleagues, Stefan Schneider, is developing a lot of para data. And so what we have not yet done completely is compare prior para data to who did or did not fail the consent screen, but it's a really good suggestion.
Okay, if there's no more questions, we can move on.